Hello fellow astronomers and welcome back to the Planetarium. And today we're going to be talking about the cornerstone of modern astronomy, the optical telescope. Big, small, and everything in between. We're going to discuss what a telescope is, how it works, and how it's evolved since the time of Galileo.
The telescope as we know of it is a relatively new tool in astronomy, only being invented in the late 1500s. Before this, astronomers would have to observe the sky with nothing more than their own two eyes. The first recorded use of a telescope for astronomy was by an Italian astronomer named Galileo Galilei. You might have heard of him before. Galileo constructed his telescope shortly after the tool was first invented. While telescope technology has evolved significantly since the time of Galileo, the concept behind the telescope has not. It remains the same: gather as much light as possible from faraway objects, and then focus it so that it can be observed by the human eye. And that's pretty much it. A common misconception about telescopes is that they're just magnifying objects in the sky. And while magnification is certainly useful, the key aspect of telescope technology is the telescope's size, or more specifically, its ability to gather light, which is determined by how large its opening is. This is why astronomers are always building bigger and bigger telescopes, because the bigger the telescope, the more light they can collect, and thus the farther and more accurately they can observe into outer space. This concept holds true with all telescopes, regardless of how big and technologically complex they may be. Even the Hubble telescope is nothing more than a sophisticated light bucket, capturing the photons, minute particles of light, from faraway stars and galaxies. In that regard, it's not much different from Galileo's telescope. However, that's where the similarities end, because while the concept is the same, not all telescopes are created equally. This is because there are a few different types of optical telescopes. However, we're only going to focus on the two main types today, which brings me to the primary focus of this video, the different types of telescopes and how they work. But before we dive into the Hubble telescope, or any research telescope for that matter, let's take a look at the amateur telescopes that you can buy for yourself. So let's begin our discussion with the same type of telescope that Galileo himself used, the refractor telescope. The refractor telescope is an incredibly simple piece of technology, consisting of only two small pieces of glass and a tube to hold them. What makes this telescope so special, though, is those two small pieces of glass, because they're a lot different than the glass on your windows. What makes this glass so special is that it's really thick and has to be polished and grinded down in a very precise method that allows it to refract and thus focus all the light passing through it. You can think of it like the opposite of a prism. Scattered light goes into the refractor and comes out more focused. You can actually see how refraction bends light outside the telescope by putting a straw in a glass of water. You see how the part of the straw underwater doesn't exactly line up with the part above? That splitting of the straw, or at least the appearance of it, is refraction. The straw isn't actually crooked, it's just that the light is being bent to create that illusion. And refractor telescopes use this natural phenomenon to focus the light of distant objects. That way, our eyes can see them far better than if we were to just look up at the sky. Refractor telescopes are great. Their simple design makes them easy to use and care for, but they do have some disadvantages. For instance, refractors have issues with objects that are really, really far away. Their design leads to something called chromatic aberration, which is just a weirdly colored halo that appears around objects, distorting their appearance in our eyes. This aberration is fixable, but to do so, you have to extend the length of the telescope tube. This can be troublesome for deep sky objects, which leads us to the other main type of telescope, the reflector. The reflector telescope, also called a Newtonian telescope, was invented only a few decades after Galileo created his refractor. And it was invented by the famous mathematician Sir Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton created his telescope to overcome some of the drawbacks that refractors provide. You see, Newton's telescopes ditched the expensive and heavy glass and opted for finely polished mirrors instead. This allowed the Newtonian telescopes to do away with chromatic aberration and allowed astronomers to view deep sky objects with greater clarity than ever before. The way the Newtonian, or reflector telescope works is by using a series of mirrors to focus all of the light it gathers, and then it takes that light and focuses it onto a separate mirror, which then reflects the light into an eyepiece for observing. Reflector telescopes, unlike their refracting counterparts, excel in viewing faraway objects. As I mentioned earlier, there's no chromatic aberration when it comes to using mirrors. The main downside to reflectors is that they actually flip the image of whatever it is they're observing, which can lead to some confusing perspectives when we look up at the moon or other objects in our solar system. On top of this, reflector telescopes are a lot more delicate than their refracting counterparts, and they tend to require regular maintenance and calibration in order to work properly, which can be difficult and also expensive. However, when it comes to powerful research telescopes like the Hubble telescope, the ESO's ELT, or even the Hubble telescope's successor, the James Webb telescope, there are no refractor telescopes. These telescopes are all Newtonian, and this is because reflecting telescopes scale way better than refractors do for deep space research. The reason for this is because when making a bigger reflector, you just need a larger mirror to gather more light. And this can even be cheated a little bit by nesting multiple smaller mirrors together, using their combined size to act like one gigantic mirror. With refracting telescopes, however, you can't just make a bigger lens. And that's because as you try to focus more light, you end up needing a longer telescope tube to do so. The larger the area of your lens, the more distance the eyepiece has to be away from it. If you've ever tried to burn something with a magnifying glass and the sun's rays, you'll know that you have to hold your magnifying glass at just the right height above your target. Otherwise, you won't burn anything at all. There's also the problem of the refractor lens itself. To make a piece of glass accurately refract light, you need it to be really thick, which also means really heavy. Both of these problems can be seen with the largest refracting telescope ever built, the Yerkes Observatory Telescope in Wisconsin. This telescope is only 1.08 meters or 40 inches in diameter, but the tube length required to focus this light into an eyepiece is 18 meters or 60 feet long. And all of the moving portions of the telescope itself, lens included, weigh a total of 20 tons. It's pretty incredible. Just to emphasize how unwieldy refractors are for research purposes, let's scale up the Yerkes Observatory to the size of the soon-to-be largest telescope in the world, the Extremely Large Telescope. Currently under construction, the Extremely Large Telescope, or the ELT, is going to have a diameter of 39 meters or 128 feet across when complete. In comparison, if we were able to make a refractor lens of the same size, our tube would have to be about 17 times the length of the lens's diameter, which means that our refractor telescope's tube would need to be 650 meters or 2,133 feet long, which is close to half a mile in length. And this is just scaling the size for the current largest telescope. Each year, scientists are planning out and trying to construct larger telescopes than this, such as the ESO's Overwhelmingly Large Telescope, which is a proposed telescope that would be 100 meters in diameter, or 328 feet across. across. Trying to make a refractor telescope of this size would be insanely expensive, if not outright impossible. This is why all optical research telescopes in the modern era of astronomy are made to be reflectors, because the logistics and engineering behind trying to make a large reflector are so complex that it's just easy to make a reflector telescope instead. So while refractors may be good as a backyard telescope, professional astronomy is almost exclusively done with reflector telescopes, at least when it comes to visible light astronomy, but that's a topic for another video.
So on that note, you can see that telescopes may not be the most complicated scientific instruments, but you can at least tell that there's some interesting science that goes into creating one. We also talked about reflector and refractor telescopes, and how refractor telescopes are very useful for researchers. Alright everybody, that's it for today. Thank you all so very much for watching, and I'll see you all next week. Goodbye!